Today, I'll kind of talk about that. I'll kind of get into the history of Alexander the Great. Of course, if you know about Macedonia, it was this kingdom that started way back during the Greek Dark Ages. They think it rose out of a city state. And then, of course, by the fourth century, Alexander the Great and his father, Philip II, we'll talk about him today. Of course, that particular state will eventually rise up, take over most of Greece. And then we'll get to the main thing, of course, today, which is they'll conquer the Persian Empire. So if you have any questions, of course, about this lecture, you can leave comments, of course, on my channel. Students can also leave comments in Canvas discussions as well. Don't forget about that. Of course, you do get bonus points for that attempt with that. So let me get, of course, a little background into Alexander the Great, of course, and the Macedonians from ancient times. If you think about Macedonia, it was a state that kind of rose out of the Greek Dark Ages. They think that this particular city-state went back probably, I want to say, 8th, 9th century BC at the latest, when it kind of started to develop in northern Greece. Then over time, it became a kingdom. And kind of talk about the name Macedonia, or also known as Macedon as well. Macedonia, you see here in this map right here, kind of show that real quick for you. But you can see Macedonia or Macedon, see developed way up in the northern part of Greece. Today. It's also, they think, part of now what is the Republic of, I think it's called North Macedon or Macedonia. And they believe that Macedonia, at least the name anyway, is derived from this ancient ancestor named Macedon, or Makednos, I think is also the other name it's often called. And so that's where the origin of the word came from. They think that this ancient ancestor was kind of like almost like equivalent to remember Helen, famous Greek ancestor and king. They believe it was like some kind of early king of that region. And so that's where the name basically came from originally. They do think that the name Macedonia does kind of translate as meaning either tall one or Highlander. And they think that this was because of the fact that the Macedonian peoples developed mostly in mountainous regions of northern Greece, especially where the Pindus Mountains are there today. And they think that originally it was pronounced Macedon or Macedonia, but over time, the name became kind of slurred. And so I think in Europe, Western Europe especially, they started to pronounce it Macedon or Macedonia. And so that's the name, of course, that they pronounce it today. Yeah, of course, by the 4th century, you start to see the rise of Macedonia. They'll eventually take over all of Greece, most of it, and then organize it into kind of a Hellenic or Greek league I'll get to later called the League of Corinth. And this mostly happened under the king Philip II. We'll talk about him first the most, and then we'll get into Alexander the Great, his son, that follows. And of course, Alexander's going to take this state. He's going to conquer most of, the Persian Empire. I think I've got this also right here, kind of a slide here. But yeah, those are some of the things, of course, right there. You can see kind of a statue of Philip II on the right. Philip, by the way, and Alexander were part of a dynasty that they call the Argead dynasty. And that's often the Greek name that they call it. And they had other kings before Philip II, but they weren't as well known until really about the mid to late 4th century BC. And Philip, you see right here, famous, by the way, for losing an eye. So I don't know if that was in battle, but I think he got some kind of illness in his eye and basically lost it. But Philip was the king of Macedonia, you can see, from 359 to 336 BC. And it's under him that Macedonia really starts to become a major power in the region. They think he's kind of the one that kind of develops a lot of their military and a lot of their strategies that Alexander the Great would use later. And one thing about Philip here, here's kind of showing also some other maps here of the. Oh, by the way, kind of looking at that map, you can see that's about where Macedonia was, like a long time ago in ancient times. You look at the right there at the top, you can see that's the region of it. And now I think Macedonia is made up of northern Greece, and then that Republic of Macedonia, which I think they changed the name to North Macedon or something like that. But that's the geographic area of where Macedonia was. That symbol, by the way, on the bottom right, that was their main symbol that they used. And I think I've got a image right here of it. The Virginia symbol, it was a symbol of the sun. And it was kind of had a lot of symbolism to it, but it was a 16 point star, which supposedly represented a combination of the 12 Olympians we talked about before, and then also the four elements that I talked about also as well. And I think Virginia was also the name of one of their cities, capitals that they ruled from. They also had other cities like Pella, which probably became more important by the time of Philip and Alexander the Great. I think that was actually one of their main capitals later. And then they also had Thessalonica as well, was another city as well that was famous. And that was the one that's now the majority city in the northern part of Greece. I think around 1 million people live there today, the modern city of Thessalonica. But yeah, one thing about Philip, he was known for developing a lot of their military tactics, which one thing that was kind of famous was the Macedonian phalanx had this thing where they used what they call the sword and shield tactic on the battlefield. And that was where the cavalry would be used as an offensive weapon, usually on the flanks of the Macedonian army to kind of probe weaknesses in the enemy. And then they had the infantry, which was kind of in the center using hoplites. They would use that as a defensive shield, basically. So yeah, the cavalry was the sword, infantry was the shield. And they used heavy phalanx formations. The Macedonian phalanx, if you know about it, the centerpiece was the use of a 16 by 16 phalanx formation, about 256 phalangites. They used these pikes, these long spears I told you about, called a sarissa, which are, I think, on average about 18 to 20 feet tall at the most. They weigh 25 pounds. Actually, I'm sorry, 15 pounds. Excuse me, 15 pounds. Pretty heavy, and they had to be carried by two hands, of course, in battle. And so, like usually, the first, I think, 4 rows or so would lower their spears in battle when they would. And that, of course, this phalanx was used to repel not just infantry but cavalry or whatever that might charge them on the battlefield. Here's kind of an image showing like the Macedonian battle formation with the infantry in the middle, and you got your cavalry on the wings. I think a lot of this was probably influenced by the Persians. Persians kind of would use these kind of tactics. And so I guess because of Xerxes coming in, invading from the north in Greece, that probably had a big impact on their, types of military tactics they used later. They also had what they call the companion cavalry. This was an elite heavy cavalry of the Macedonians that by Philip's time they had kind of developed. And it was, like I said, the main offensive weapon that was used to break enemies' flanks. They would usually try to probe weaknesses in it. And it was about 2,000 to 3,000 men that were in it, at least around the time of Alexander the Great's reign. And it was called the companion cavalry, because they all kind of knew each other. And most of them came from the nobility ranks in Macedonia. So I think early on in Philip's reign, you know about it, Alexander actually led the companion cavalry. He used it a lot to win a lot of battles against Persia. Also, Philip had several wives. I think he had something like 7 at one point, if you know about this. And the most famous wife he had was Queen Olympias, who was from the city-state of Epirus, it's called, which is, I think, now where Albania is. And that was like his most famous wife he had. She's important later because she's the wife, of course, of him, but especially the mother of Alexander the Great. And she'll kind of be very influential, of course, in influencing Alexander. She's kind of a de facto ruler, by the way, when Alexander's gone. And after Alexander died, she was kind of ruthless. I think I'll get to it later, but one of the generals that took over the kingdom after Alexander died had to have her killed. She was that kind of ruthless. Now, one of the things that happened next, I'll get to Alexander the Great later. That's, of course, her son with Philip that we have. We'll get to him a little later with that. But Philip, one of the things that happens by about the mid to late 4th century, he starts to consolidate Macedonian power in southern Greece. And of course, you'll see this slide here. He basically forces the Greek city-states, I think minus Sparta, to join this alliance together that's called the League of Corinth. It was nicknamed. It's also sometimes called the Hellenic League or Greek League as well. And that's the main alliance that will be used to invade Persia and conquer it. They think the idea of conquering Persia was Philip II's idea, and then Alexander took it and went with it after his father was assassinated. And so Alexander was only 20, when that would happen. And so that's really one of the big turning points we'll get to with Macedonia here. But you can see here on the bottom there, kind of that yellow area, that whole area, he actually came down with his forces and fought several battles against them. I think the Battle of Corinthia, I think, was one of the most famous. He fought 338 BC, I think it was. And after that, the Greeks capitulated into this alliance with the Macedonians. Thebes, Corinth, Athens, a bunch of those city-states were kind of in it as well. I think the only one that wasn't was Sparta. Sparta wanted to still align with the Persian Empire, which they were. They were later neutralized later. But what happens, if you know about this, in the year 336 BC, Philip is assassinated at this, I think it was a royal banquet for I want to say his niece was getting married. And this assassin named Pausanias, who they think was an ex-bodyguard, stabbed Philip and murdered him. And so they think that that, of course, will allow Alexander the Great to seize power afterwards. They're not sure who was really behind it. They think it was more than one person involved, like in a conspiracy. I think there's two theories. One, that Olympias herself, which was Philip's wife, may have actually planned it to try to kill him off and put her son on the throne, Alexander. The other theory was that the Persians were behind it. The Persians didn't want, Philip invading, the Persian Empire. And so that's why they killed him. So I think those are the two main theories. But some people think that it's possible that his wife may have killed him, had him killed, actually. So, due to that, of course, because of the fact that, his father's now dead, Alexander comes in. He basically seizes power, starts to consolidate his power at that point. And so he'll take power in 336 BC and reigns till 323 BC, about 13 years that he's in power. And they call him, his real actual name, if you study about it, is actually Alexandros. I think that's usually the romanticized version of his name usually. And then over time, what happened was that I guess by the time of Roman times, they start calling him Alexander the Great. Like a lot of famous rulers are sometimes called, like the Persian rulers, kind of the same thing, great rulers or whatever. And so Dame's not called till later. Let me get into some background about Alexander. So They think what happened after his father died on 336 BC. See this image right here. One of the first things I'm going to get to later, he's going to have to consolidate his power. He's got like other heirs, I think, that could have gotten the throne. So he has them eliminated so he can take power at that point. He'll have to march on Greece and actually consolidate his power down there because they actually end up rebelling against him. I think including Thebes. And so in 335 BC, he had to actually march down into Thebes and basically force them to, adhere to the League of Corinth. Now that alliance, of course, that his father had formed. Actually, Thebes, I think, was the big power in Greece at the time in the south. He actually sacked the city and razed most of it to the ground. And so that's going to force them back into this alliance with Macedonia. And then he's going to use that to eventually invade, of course, Persia later. Some background about Alexander, kind of go through it, but these are some of the sources that write about Alexander and his life. Of course, Diodorus of Sicily, if you know much about that, that's actually the oldest source on Alexander that goes back to around the 1st century BC. It's kind of weird, but there are not too many sources between the 4th and the 1st century BC. They're actually lost, believe it or not. And so these are the only sources that are still extant around that are based on the life of Alexander. So yeah, Library of World History, Volume 8 is actually the oldest source on Alexander. Plutarch and Arrian of Nicomedia, those two are actually Greek sources that were famous back in Greco-Roman times. Plutarch might be one of the most famous. The life of Alexander. Plutarch was, mostly a Greek biographer and historian. He wrote a series of books that were called the Parallel Lives, where he compared Alexander to, I think, Julius Caesar. And so that one's a lot of biographical information about Julius Caesar. And then 3, Arrian of Nicomedia, they think that might be one of the best ones too that was written. The Anabasis of Alexander, written around the same time when Plutarch was written. And that one goes into a lot of the campaigns of Alexander. And then they do have a Roman one too, Quintius Curtius Rufus, who wrote histories of Alexander the Great around the same period, I guess, 1st, 2nd century, about when that was written. That's also another source as well. That's also pretty good. Although I think some people kind of lean more toward the Greek sources than the Roman ones. But it's weird how there's a lot of missing sources on Alexander. They actually think there were a series of diaries that were written on Alexander's campaigns by a nephew of Aristotle named, I think it's believed his name was Callisthenes or something like that. And it was called the Royal Diaries. They think that may have been one of the original sources on Alexander and his campaigns, but a lot of those original sources don't exist anymore. Of course, there's a lot of stories about Alexander they always talk about. They have the story of Bucephalus. You may have heard about this. When he was very young, he got this horse through his father, and the horse was actually a gift to Philip II, but it was so wild, would buck people off, they were going to get rid of it. And Alexander, who was, I want to say 12 or 13 at the time, said he would buy the horse and try to ride it. And of course, they laughed at him about the horse. Anyway, he was able to figure out why the horse was so skittish and so wild. It was actually afraid of its own shadow. And so he was able to figure out how to ride it. And then, of course, the horse becomes very, very famous. It's like one of the first, I guess, horses you hear about in classical times. Rides it across the Persian Empire as he conquered it. And Bucephalus was a name he called it, which meant ox head, because I guess it was kind of stubborn. There's other stories about Alexander. You may have heard the story about him and Aristotle, of course. Aristotle was brought to Macedonia to open up a school to teach Macedonian nobility's children. So they think from the age of maybe 13 to like maybe 15 or 16, Alexander was taught by Aristotle. And so he was a major influence on his life. Um, I think there's a story where Aristotle gave Alexander an annotated copy of the Iliad, which was, one of his favorite books he liked to read. They think the story of the Iliad, the Trojan War, was a major influence on Alexander on wanting to conquer the world. So one genius to another, you know, both had kind of probably influences on each other overall. You also hear stories about I'll get to him conquering Macedonia and all that, but there's also this story about him and he had this friend named Ephesian you may have heard about. That's also famous. I don't think I've got an image of that, but Ephesian was this uh, Macedonian general that he had. I think it was part of his personal bodyguard. And of course, there are rumors in modern times that they were lovers. I think I've got images showing them together later. I have, but they're not sure if that's true or not. I know a lot of people speculate that, and it's been speculated in movies too. I think the 2004 Alexander the Great movie by Oliver Stone. They kind of, I think, kind of pushed that idea, but they're not sure if that's correct or not. But the Greeks were known for being bisexual. If you know about that. Now, like I said, with that map right there, of course, like Alexander had to come down into southern Greece. Like I said, he consolidated that League of Corinth together again. Of course, he persuaded them in by 334 BC to invade the Achaemenid Empire, which at the time was being ruled by this king named King Darius III, who I do have an image of right here. He reigned over Persia from 338 to 330 BC. By the way, Darius III was the last major ruler of the Achaemenid Empire. I think he was, I want to say, in his mid 30s, like 34, maybe, when he went up against Alexander, who was, I want to say, just 21 when he invaded Persia. And so I don't know if you know much about the Persian invasion by the Greeks. They think it was initially done to try and free all the Greeks that were under Persian rule. I think that was the initial thing they were trying to do with it, not really conquer. I don't know if they thought they could conquer the whole thing, but maybe conquer part of like where Western Turkey is, basically. But I guess because the fact that the Persian Empire was weak and Darius III was a weak ruler, they were able to march in there and eventually conquer it, which they did. And kind of show you a map here, but I'll kind of show it a lot off and on. But that's the map, the route of Alexander's conquest, of what he would eventually conquer all of what is mostly the Persian Empire that forms into an empire later, Empire of Alexander, which never really had an official name. Some people call it the Greek Empire or Macedonian Empire. But you can see in the they think the spring of 334 BC, he launched his invasion into what is now Turkey today by crossing the Hellespont, uh, where the Dardanelles Strait is, northwestern Turkey. And they think he had close to about 40,000 forces, which included Macedonian and also Greek forces that were part of the League of Corinth. And they have one battle they fought, which was, I guess, the first strategic battle they had was the Battle of Granicus, which was fought near a river called Granicus River, also I think pronounced sometimes Granicus River as well, the spring of 334. And it was fought actually not that far down the road from where ancient Troy was, because there's a famous story where Alexander actually went to ancient Troy and visited the tomb of Achilles. There really was a tomb there at the time because that was just like his idol. And so that was very important, that early part of the campaign, because Alexander was able to seize control of the western part of Turkey, start pushing into the interior of Western Persia at the time. Here's kind of a slide right here, but yeah, that's the initial invasion into what is the western part of Persia, where Anatolia or Western Turkey is at that time. They do think that what ends up happening is it forces Darius to bring in a larger army, which from I guess from central Persia to fight him, and so the two are going to eventually meet up. both their armies. They actually fight twice, if you know about this, Alexander versus Darius. That battle will be the Battle of Issus, which occurs, they think, around November of 330 BC. It's the first of these two major battles. The other one I'll get to later is the Battle of Gaugamela, which is that actual short little video you're watching at the beginning from the 1956 movie Alexander the Great. It's kind of a, I guess, a reenactment of that battle. It's also, I think, Oliver Stone did one too, the 2004 Alexander movie as well. And Darius, they think, had a much larger force than Alexander did. However, if you kind of look at this map here, and by the way, that's that Alexander mosaic that's very famous, which was found at Pompeii. I want to say going back to the 19th century. Alexander the Great mosaic, or it's also called the Battle of Issus mosaic as well, which is based on that battle in history. It's actually kind of been restored a lot, but it shows the battle. It shows also Darius on one side on the right, and then you can see Alexander on Bucephalus on the left. They think that painting was done sometime maybe close to about 100 BC under the Roman Republic. It's a very famous painting, by the way, in the Roman world. Here's another variation of kind of a colorized one. They've kind of taken these and tried to restore them about what they may have looked like, I guess, complete. But kind of showing the battlefield before what happened. Well, I got Alexander coming up the coast there, kind of going down the southern coast of Turkey where the Gulf of Issus is. And then you've got also what is Darius' forces coming in from the east. Actually, it's weird, but they pass each other up. In fact, Alexander started pushing down toward where the Syrian gates are in Syria, and he had to come back up and fight Darius' forces. And they fight near this river right here that's kind of in between them. There's like mountains hemmed in to the east. I think the mountains are called the Amanus Mountains right there, you can see. And that was kind of actually an advantage to Alexander, because apparently, for some reason, Darius couldn't get all his forces in, which was a larger army. And so Alexander took advantage of that. And using his companion cavalry, which played a role in a lot of these major battles that he won, he was able to break through Darius's left flank, which would eventually cause his army to collapse. In fact, Darius would actually flee the battle, which is something he's kind of known for. If you go back to that short video at the beginning of this lecture, they're kind of laughing about that, him fleeing the battle of Darius. He fled that when he fled Gaugamela too, as well. So you can see here the companion cavalry is crashing through Darius's left flank. And it was such a decisive victory, by the way, that if you know what occurred with Darius, his family actually supported Alexander after the battle, because they thought, I guess, Darius was such a coward. And so that's something you actually see. I think Darius's wife, his mother, I think he had two daughters. They all supported Alexander afterwards. I think Alexander went on to marry one of Darius' daughters. Believe it or not, I think he would end up marrying two women, Alexander the Great. I think the one that's more famous is Roxana, who he will marry later. But that's very important. The Battle of Issus is really, I think, the turning point in the whole really war against Persia at that time. And so what happens here, you go to this map here, you can see that it allows Alexander then to march southward, down through Syria at that point. And he's going to pretty much take the whole western half of the Persian Empire. He's going to take over Syria. He's going to take over where Lebanon and Israel is. And then he's going to march by 332. He's going to march into Egypt and take over that as well. I think the only thing he had trouble with, if you look at that map, was Tyre, which was a fortified city. It took him something like 7 months to take it in 332 BC. He actually had to bring up special, I think, siege engines and storm the city. But eventually took it. And then, of course, his most triumphant thing, was marching into Egypt at that time. And the Egyptians, believe it or not, the Egyptians were happy to have Alexander come in because they hated the Persians. They had been ruled by the Persians for something like 200 years. And so they declared at that point that Alexander was Pharaoh, Pharaoh of Egypt. They declared that he was the son of Amun or son of Amun Ra. And there's actually a famous story. If you go back to that map I just showed you, uh, I'll show you this right here. But if you go to the kind of left hand side, there's a story where from Memphis, I think it was, he traveled to what is called the Siwa Oasis using his horse Bucephalus. He traveled there to go see the oracle of Amun, who met with him, and he told him some kind of great prophecy, but they don't know what it is. It's kind of a mystery about that. He may have told him that he was going to conquer the world. They don't know. But after that, he was declared the son of Amun, and of course became the Pharaoh of Egypt. And so that was kind of a famous point in his life at that point. And one of the things he's well known for, of course, when he's in Egypt, is he begins building the city of Alexandria, which you see here, image of Alexandria, the modern city today. It was built and designed by him. It was, believe it or not. And in fact, he began designing a lot of the streets and where all the buildings would go. It's kind of like, if you know about on the Mediterranean Sea to the west of the Nile, where the delta is. And it is famous for its lighthouse that was erected afterwards, the so-called Lighthouse of Pharos, which at one point was one of the Greeks' seven wonders of the world. Then they think he started, I think, commissioning the building of the Library of Alexandria, which held a lot of famous works of the world at the time. Alexandria is going to be very important, by the way. The building of Alexandria, later becomes the center of the Hellenistic culture in that region of the Near East. So it's kind of a very centralized cultural city that'll be well known. And here's kind of a map of the city of what it looked like. Essentially, kind of that fortress, if you see right there, it kind of looks kind of similar to where they think like the lighthouse of Pharos was and all that. You can see some of the important buildings that are there. The one that's, I guess, the big one that's in that middle part right there is the Library and Museum of the Library of Alexandria that was there at one point. There's like a new one I think they've built since, I want to say, early 2000s, but the original library burned down, if you know about that, during Julius Caesar's time due to a civil war. So anyway, it's kind of talking about Alexandria and, of course, some of the things that he did. They do think his tomb is later buried there somewhere in the ancient city of Alexandria. They think that was later done by one of his generals. I'll get to Ptolemy, but they're not sure where it is. There's a lot of mystery behind the tomb of Alexander. Is it in Egypt? Some people think it's actually in Greece. Also as well, maybe Pella, possibly, but they do think in ancient times that there were cases where emperors actually went to visit the tomb of Alexander's. They do think it was there. I think there was a story where Caligula, may have been that emperor, actually took the armor of Alexander the Great and wore it or something like that. And so they do think it was a real tomb, but they don't know what happened to it. So a big mystery about that. I guess if they ever find that, that'll be an amazing feat, in archaeology. Now, one more thing before I get to him finishing off Darius. There is one thing that did happen in 331 BC. Darius tried to negotiate some kind of peace agreement between the Greeks and Persia. So he sent like ambassadors to Alexander, but he rejected it. There's different theories on why he rejected it. I think he thought that the Persian Empire was weak and that he'd be able to conquer the rest of it. I think also the fact that he wanted revenge against the Persians because, the Persians had invaded Greece a long time ago. So he saw this as an opportunity to get back at them. And so he rejected the peace offering. There was a case where he met with his generals, by the way, about this idea of peace negotiations to end the war with Persia. One of his generals thought it was a great idea, which was Parmenion. And Alexander replied something like, if I was Parmenion, I would do it. So he decided to reject it. And of course, what ends up happening is he invades into what is Mesopotamia. So that's the next thing I'm going to get into and talk about is the so-called Battle of Gaugamela that comes in next, which Gaugamela is really the pivotal battle at the end that really finishes off the Persian Empire. It happens, they think, in October of 331 BC. It's kind of a debate about when it was. I think I want to say early October, close to maybe October 1st when it happened. It has different names. They call it Gaugamela, which they think was a name that came from a nearby village that was called Gaugamela, which I think meant something like the camel's house, is what it translated as meaning. Also, they think it's the name. They have another name, which is either Erbil or Erbella, which is also the name of an Iraqi city that's in the northeastern part of Iraq in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. So they think that's about where the battle took place between him and Darius III, the second battle and most pivotal battle in the end. Here's kind of an image you can see. I have a painting that was done later of the two. And kind of show it right here. So October 331 BC. They do think that Alexander's forces was badly outnumbered. Of course, I've got numbers there, 50,000 to 250,000. They think those numbers are kind of disputed. I think there's a theory that Alexander had maybe 40, 50,000 at the most. And then the ancient sources say anywhere from 250,000 to 1,000,000 that Darius had. But they probably think it was half that, like maybe 120,000, I think is a good average of about what it is. And supposedly the battlefield where they fought was actually handpicked by Darius III. He even brought in these special charioteers that used these skid chariots with skids on the side to cut people down. They turned out to be worthless in the battle. Here's kind of an image of the battlefield and their movements. The army of Darius was large, much larger than Alexander. It could have been like only 2 to 3 to 1, but it was so large that he easily could have been swallowed up by this Persian army. And so Alexander tried to spread out his forces, to make Darius do the same thing. And so using his phalanx and mostly his companion cavalry, he tried to attack at Darius's left flank, you see. And what happened, it was a trick, if you know about this. And what happened in the middle of the battle, Alexander switched his forces at a 90-degree angle and attacked really at Darius's kind of left center flank there. And what happened when he attacked at his royal bodyguard, he went right after Darius, if you know about that. He panicked again, like he did at the Battle of Issus, and he fled the battlefield second time. Now, they almost had a problem, though. Like some of the Persian forces actually broke through. They attacked him on his left flank, but Alexander had some auxiliary force in the back to stop him. And so after that, he was able to mop up Darius' army. And most of the force that was left over was either captured, which a lot of them were captured, if you read about the casualties from ancient times. I think it's at 200,000-300,000 captured, which is kind of ridiculous. But after that, Alexander was able then to start taking over pretty much the entire Persian Empire. And he was only like 25 or 26 when he, of course, succeeded defeating Darius III. So very, very young age when he, does all this, Alexander the Great. That was like his pivotal moment right there in the defeat of Darius III. From there, he then marched on Babylon. So he took the city of Babylon after that in Iraq. There's an idea that they think that Alexander was going to make that his capital, kind of like the central part of his whole empire. He had decided to rebuild Babylon, rebuild the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which I think was kind of collapsing at the time. And so from there, he then marched eastward. You can go to this map here, but from what is Babylon, he then marched and took Susa. He then took, of course, all the different cities in Iran. He took Susa, Persepolis, Pasargadae. He took Ecbatana as well. So pretty much just mopping up the rest of the empire. There is something famous, though, that he did. You may have heard about Alexander. He took the city of Persepolis, which I told you was their main capital since going back to the time of Darius the Great. And in a fit of rage, he burned it down. Now, there's been different theories on why he burned it down, but they think it was some kind of retaliation because the fact that Persia had attacked Greece, they burned Athens, and so he did it in return. There's a famous story where he had this prostitute, they think, from Greece, and she egged him on to burn it down. I don't know if that's a true story or not, but that's been claimed. And I think they say he was drunk when he did it, but I don't know if that was true or not either. So yeah, he burned it down, which is kind of a tragic thing. So that's why you only see, if you go to Persepolis in southern Iran, that's all you see is ruins from it actually being burned. I think that was the main palace right there that was there originally with this massive staircase in the front that Alexander, of course, had burned down. Of course, he kept marching. He does find Darius, by the way. You go up there to where the kind of east of the Caspian Sea. He finds Darius III killed by his own men, which he hasn't buried afterwards. He actually had the men hunted down, the ones that killed Darius, because he wanted to kill him himself, I guess. And so from there, he marches into what is Afghanistan. He then marches into Pakistan and northern India. And so you can see he's basically conquering the rest of the Persian Empire that's in the eastern part, all the way to the Indus River Valley, which is the furthest east that he actually reaches at one point. He does have this one more battle he does fight that you may have heard about when he marches into India, in northern India, in what is the Punjab region. He does fight this battle called the Battle of the Hydaspes. They think it happened in the spring of 326 BC. And he fought against this king named Porus. You may have heard of him. And that's actually an image of him, I think, in that picture on the right. Alexander, it's kind of in blue. I think the guy behind him is Ephesian, that famous general under him that was his best friend, maybe lover. I'm not sure that's really true or not. But I think that's him. I guess Porus was wounded or something, maybe lying down. But he would fight him in what is the northern part of India. The river is a tributary of the Indus River. It's also called Jhelum, which is the Indian name they use today. Greeks call it Hydaspes. And apparently Alexander was camped on the other side, which on the western side of the river. And then Porus's forces were on the eastern side of the river. And if you know about this, it was actually during the monsoon season, which was starting up around May of 326. And Alexander did an amazing thing. He actually crossed the river on, I guess, what is the right flank of Porus and attacked him on that flank. And it's part of why he won the battle. Kind of an amazing feat right there. So Alexander's like an amazing general, for that time period. And if you know about that battle, Porus was famous for using war elephants, which is something that I think the Persians had elephants too, but they were used more for like pack animals and things like that. So it's really the first case where they actually fight war elephants. The Romans later have to fight elephants against the Carthaginians and Hannibal as well. But it's kind of like the peak of the use of elephants in the classical age. But he's able to defeat Porus's forces, but it was a bloody battle. I think they think one of his bloodiest battles that he fought really out of all of them. It's really weird about Porus. They think that after the battle had ended, uh, they thought maybe he'd kill Porus or something like that, but he actually treated him like a king and made him a satrap of that region to rule that part of his Eastern Empire. And so I think he liked Porus because of the fact that he had stood up, tried to stand up to him and fight instead of like Darius fleeing the battle. So he really thought he was a brave, general, for doing that. Now, if you know what happened, though, Alexander, yeah, he won the battle of, Hydaspes at that point. But after the victory, what occurred, his forces mutinied against him. In fact, they went to this river called the Hyphasis, which is kind of a little to the east of the Hydaspes River in the Punjab region of northern India. And they sat down and refused to move. This went on for something like 3 days. And Alexander sat in his tent and hoping that they would change their mind because he was hoping to conquer the rest of India. And so he was actually forced to return westward back towards Babylon. I think his men were tired of fighting, which they'd been doing for 8 or 9 years that they had been fighting. And there's an old saying they used to say later about Alexander is that he wept because he had no more worlds to conquer. So yeah, if you go to this map here that I got, Alexander then takes his forces down to the bottom, like the mouth of the Indus River, the far eastern part of that map there, where the Arabian Sea is. Half his forces went back by ship. This guy named, I think Narcus, I think his name was, a general, brought them back through what is the Persian Gulf. And then Alexander, between 326 to 325, probably 324, brought his forces, the rest of it, back through the deserts of Persia. And it's really crazy, but he actually lost more forces than the men that was with him on the way back to Babylon from all the battles he fought in. That's kind of crazy about that, how that happens. However, he gets back, if you know, I think within, I want to say 9 months, he's dead. Alexander the Great. And they think in June of 323 BC, Alexander dies, they think, grew ill, I think over a week or two. He got weaker and weaker. They think he went into a coma and eventually died at the age of 32. And so that was the end of whatever kind of dream he had of this empire he was forming. And of course, there's been a lot of images and paintings that have been made of Alexander the Great. Here's kind of an old painting, I guess, showing him on his deathbed. It's probably romanticized, of course. And his men kept asking him, who should they give the throne to? Alexander had 2 wives. His second wife, Roxana, was pregnant, who would later have a son, Alexander IV, but they didn't know, what that would be at that point. And so his men kept asking, who should we give the throne to? And so Alexander said something like, it should go to the strongest. And so that left a lot of things open, because the fact that Alexander really died without a viable heir at that point. And so what's going to happen? What's going to happen, if you know about this, it's going to create a series of civil wars that are called the Wars of the Diadochi, where Alexander's generals are going to start fighting over his empire. They're going to break it up. And so what could have been this massive empire that ruled from, Greece to Egypt, all the way to the Indus River, was no more. It was all broken up during this period. And I'll kind of talk about it now, but they do think that Alexander's conquest started a new period historically. If you read about, which is called the Hellenistic Age or Hellenistic Era, I don't know if it really had an official name. I think they also call it Hellenistic Period. It lasts about 3 centuries, from the 4th to the 1st century BC. 323 to 30 BC is roughly, I guess, when they date it from Alexander's death, and then down to the time of Queen Cleopatra when she died. And I think if I had a slide on that or not, I think I've got one right here I can share with you. But they think his conquest brought on this new period. The term Hellenistic, by the way, is derived from the word Hellen, which remember is the word for the Greeks a long time ago. And so the Hellenistic age, in a sense, Hellenized everybody, Hellenized all the world of the Near East. And so it spread Greek culture, language, science, technology, religion, philosophy, arts, all throughout the Near East, influencing parts of Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, even India was influenced, of course, by Alexander the Great and all that. And so that's something that's kind of famous, about that period of Alexander, really influencing, of course, what happens. Now, kind of look at this map right here. That's the map of the wars of the Diadochi that we're talking about. So, yeah, they would fight over that vast amount of land that you're looking at, from, Macedonia all the way to India and down into Egypt, etc. And what happened was, over time, these areas were broken up into states, which I guess the name they call it sometimes is Hellenistic states or Hellenistic kingdoms, is what they nickname it usually. And I'll kind of go through some of the men that helped found these states over time. Here's kind of a map showing you where they'll be. Those are the Greek names, by the way, of these states and dynasties that kind of form out of it. You got the Ptolemaics, you see down there in yellow in Egypt. The Seleucids or Seleucids, which of course, Seleucid Empire, that's mostly like in the eastern part of what was Alexander's empire. Iran, Iraq mostly is kind of around where it is, part of Syria later. Antigonid Kingdom and Dynasty, Turkey and Syria. You've got a few others that are minor ones all over the place. Lysimachian state was also another one that was kind of a minor one. I'll get to Cassandros. He'll take Macedonia and kind of separate it as a kingdom as well. But yeah, here's one, of course, one of the most famous, which is Ptolemy the First, known as Ptolemy the First Soter. And he was a Macedonian general under Philip II and Alexander. And if you know about him, he took over Egypt after Alexander died during these, so-called Wars of the Diadochi, which, by the way, the Wars of the Diadochi means the Wars of the Successors. It's what it means in Greek, Diadochi. And he's famous for taking the body of Alexander, believe it or not, and bringing it to Egypt, where they think he had it buried. They think originally he may have buried Alexander in Memphis, and then the body got moved to Alexandria, where they think it is today. But like I said, they don't know where it is. But the Ptolemaic dynasty is around till like 30 BC. I think they have something like 15 rulers that reigned at one point. Most of them are named Ptolemy, from Ptolemy the First to Ptolemy the 14th. And then you do have also Queen Cleopatra, who's a direct descendant of theirs, who was one of the last rulers that dies in 30 BC when the Romans take over Egypt. Then you got this other ruler named Seleucus. Of course, Seleucus the First Nicator. He was the king that founded the so-called Seleucids, Seleucid Empire. Seleucid Empire was really the largest empire formed out of the former, regions of Alexander's empire. He was another general that went back to the time of, I guess, Philip and Alexander. And his empire would last to the first century too, 312 to 63 BC. It controlled Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and actually ruled from the capital of Antioch. You know about that, which is in Syria now. But it'll later be conquered by the Romans, just like Egypt is with the Ptolemaic Kingdom. So yeah, that one. Then you've got also Cassander. He was another one too. Cassander, of course, was this king of Macedonia. He actually was the son of Antipater. He was a general that was under Alexander, and he actually eventually becomes the king of it. I think I'll kind of show it right here. But yeah, they had two rulers, of course, that were famous. They had Antipater. He was a general under Alexander, and then after he died, his son took over. And if you know about Cassander, I was kind of talking about this earlier. He was famous for killing off Alexander's family, like the rest of it, because they think Queen Olympia survived for a bunch of years after Alexander died. So did Roxana, one of the wives of Alexander. And I told you, Roxana and Alexander had a son, Alexander IV. He had them all murdered. So he was kind of ruthless, Cassander. But Olympias was also ruthless too. She had a lot of people killed in Macedonia, I think, before that. And so that's part of why it killed her off, because she was kind of too powerful and all that. But yeah, that's kind of like some of the different rulers that kind of took over. They had another one. I was trying to think if I had that one too. I think I do. They had one more. I guess I'll mention too. That was famous also, which is this man named Antigonus. They called him different names. I think he's usually called Antigonus the One-Eyed. He actually formed his own state, Antigone dynasty or Antigone kingdom, that was in Thrace and Turkey. It didn't last long. I think it collapsed in 301 BC. He was an interesting general, going back to Alexander and Philip. He wanted to keep the empire together. And so that's part of what caused the war to break out. And he was eventually killed at the Battle of Ipsus during the main part of the Wars of the Diadochi. And so after his death, the whole empire of Alexander pretty much disintegrated into multiple states. And so it never really got back together after that. So pretty much broken up and stays that way. And most of these states, like in that Hellenistic age, we're talking about, most of them get conquered by the Roman Empire is what eventually occurs. And I guess the Romans kind of absorb all this Greek culture that's circulating throughout that whole Mediterranean region and become kind of like the Greeks as well. Now, Alexander, like overall about him, they consider him to be one of the greatest conquerors in not just ancient times, but probably of all time. I think they consider him to be one of the greatest conquerors in history. He was never defeated in battle. That's one of the most amazing things about Alexander the Great. Unbeatable, I guess, overall. It's kind of a what if, what if he had lived? What if Alexander lived, into like his 50s or whatever, like another 20 years? He might have conquered the rest of Europe, maybe conquered, where the Romans would be, or conquered North Africa. It's kind of a debate about what would happen, if Alexander would have lived and all that. But he has been compared with a lot of other generals, Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar, Scipio Africanus. You can, of course, name all kinds of generals, Hannibal, Carthaginian times, all that. So, yeah, he is considered, one of the greatest, generals in history. And it's kind of a what if, what happened, of course, with his empire. So, yeah, it's kind of a short historical period. You really study about, of course, that. Now, next week, I'll be moving on to talk about the history of the Romans. So I'll kind of talk about the rise of the Roman state, the Republic. Of course, I'll later get to the famous Roman Empire, which is really probably the biggest part of their historical civilization. So I'll kind of get to that later. I did want to remind you that I'm going to be posting this second exam bonus quiz on the history of Alexander. You see there in its conquests. It's going to be worth bonus points. It's kind of be able to help you out, I guess, in the semester, because we're kind of like, past the midterm and all that. So you'll get 2 attempts on it, but I think I'm going to be averaging out the bonus points. So whatever you make, like if you make a 30 and a 40 on it, you'll make 35 or something like that. So you only get 2 attempts on it. I'm not going to give you any extra attempts. So just 2 attempts is all you're going to, of course, get for that assignment. I'll be posting that, of course, in what is, I guess, week 11. So that's it for today. Of course, with this recorded lecture, of course, on the rise of Macedonia and Alexandria. And of course, I'll see you, of course, next week.